Chapter 41, MCIs and Triage. Start here with a scene and quote from 10 Things I Hate About You, a modern retelling of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. If I'm starting a PowerPoint that doesn't immediately focus on Ryan Gosling or something with Heath Ledger in it, it's probably a major mistake, but mostly this was just the idea of what an MCI is and the idea that we can be overwhelmed, and it reminded me of this quote of just being whelmed. But one of the things we want to go over, or the things we want to go over here primarily, is mass casualty incidents, incident command systems, and triage. There's a lot of stuff in the book that I don't value in this chapter, and I'm trying to highlight the things I do value for you. But it shouldn't mean that you don't read the book and don't read the stuff I don't value, because, as I always say, I don't write your last test, and it could be good information. Primarily with mass casualty incidents, we want to be able to identify who the command staff is, who the general staff is, and what their various jobs might be. As far as incident command systems, we want to know what to do if we're on an MCI, and we want to be able to identify the various areas and zones. And finally, we want to end with the experience of being able to know what triage is and how to effectively execute it. We're going to start here with a video that I think just kind of sums up the experience conceptually. This is actually from British Columbia, Canada, but it's a great video, and Canadians are awesome. So we'll watch that for just a moment.
A look at ICS for local government.
Whoops.
A look at ICS for local government. Public Works in action. An emergency can strike at any time and might require Public Works to collaborate with others on site. Just like fire, police, and ambulance, Public Works personnel will need to respond in a safe and coordinated manner. To do this effectively, these agencies need to use a consistent approach. The Incident Command System, or ICS, is used to command, control, clearly communicate, and coordinate emergency response. It's used around the world as an effective means for managing single and multi-agency incidents. ICS uses a number of key principles which guide response activities. The following modules highlight a few of these principles, including elements of safety and accountability, the 5 primary management functions, the process for assuming and transferring command, a flexible and expandable organization, and how incident action plans are implemented to provide a common direction. With ICS, any agency can effectively manage incidents that reach beyond the scope of their day-to-day work. ICS Module 1. The initial call-out. In this scenario, first responders are receiving reports of a sinkhole and flooding in the city of Denton. Fire and police respond to the scene. Fire assumes the role of incident commander to address immediate life safety issues. The incident commander is the person responsible for all aspects of an emergency and remains in charge until the situation is resolved. They bring personnel together in a systematic manner, ensuring safety, efficiency, and accountability. The incident commander is easily identified by their green vest. The incident commander requests that police set up roadblocks to keep vehicles and pedestrians out. After determining there are no immediate life safety issues, the incident commander contacts dispatch and requests support from Public Works. Public Works dispatches a supervisor and 4-person crew. When they arrive on scene, the supervisor reports to the incident commander for an incident briefing. This briefing includes basic information about the incident, the allocated resources, and the incident safety measures. Following the briefing, Fire transfers command to Public Works, as it is determined that this is a public works incident and there are no life safety issues. The supervisor notifies dispatch about the transfer and puts on the green vest to clearly identify their new role as incident commander. The incident commander then transfers the incident command post to the public works truck. This is a safe location near the site where personnel can meet and make decisions. The incident commander sizes up the situation by evaluating the scene and identifying available resources. The incident commander decides to appoint a safety officer to oversee the safety of all personnel on scene. This person wears a red vest. The incident commander also appoints another person from Public Works as Operations Section Chief. This person is responsible for directing response activities according to an action plan. They wear an orange vest. This management team can now start to identify priorities and establish the action plan. ICS Module 2.
So, again, this is British Columbia's version of that. So there's some things that change there. The fact that the different officers and division chiefs, section chiefs, and the like wear different vests is perhaps the most important part. Knowing what color those are is not not relevant. Skip past this here. What's, I suppose, important to know about this is that the UN, actually, the United Nations, kind of said to the world and anybody in the UN that we need to set up this idea of incident command systems, and so that way we can all kind of work together. And for us, it was the Department of Homeland Security that really instituted it. But the book goes into a bit of detail about multiple casualty incidents and disasters. I'm not super hip on those words or definitions. We don't encounter them a whole lot, or at least when we do, it's not largely relevant for us. Mass casualty incidents, or MCI, however, is something that we'll definitely see on registry, that we'll definitely see in a long enough career. Ultimately, this is just a description of again, like in 10 Things I Hate About You, the discussion of being whelmed or overwhelmed in this case. So again, as we've mentioned before, it could be 50 people on a scene, and that's certainly going to overwhelm not only you, but perhaps your entire company. But it could also be, and where I think most people make the mistake of, is when you've just got 2 clinicians on a scene, and now you suddenly have 2 or 3 patients with 2 or 3 critical patients, and they don't even realize they're on an MCI at the time. And that even in some of the most fundamental calls that we run, if there are multiple patients, then you immediately enact at least a type of triage. Maybe not to the full detail of using start and jumpstart triage, but you're definitely trying to prioritize where your resources are most valuable. So again, may just be a few patients, maybe a ton of patients. Certainly the more patients you have, the more involved the process is, the more hierarchical the structure will be. One vocab that pops up here, the discussion of mutual aid, is good to know, both as a student and as a clinician. There are times where you'll have border disputes. You know, if you get a call that is on the border, literal border of one county to the next, or one company's area of control to the next, where you and another ambulance show up and have a discussion about whose call this actually belongs to. And we can get into that more later, but there are plenty of times when you are specifically requesting that an ambulance from a different company comes to help you. And that would be an example of mutual aid. Just having other companies, other areas help you and affect you. Fire does it relatively frequently. If they need more resources and calling other departments over and the like. And a quick discussion about FEMA as kind of the order of institutions, I guess I want to say. UN says to UN people, hey, we need you to create ICS so we can all get on the same page. America's Department of Homeland Security says, sure, no problem. We're going to set up FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, so that they can implement a national incident management system here called NIMS. NIMS is our country's approach to incident command system, about how to get mutual aid or multi-system, multi-agency involvement on a project, like a major car accident or something of the like. You are required, of course, both to do your job and through this course get IAS 100, 200, 700, as well as completing the TIMS, which is essentially the traffic version of NIMS. Basically just how to work a multi-body agency on a major traffic incident. So when we talk about the incident command system, specifically its structure, no one expects you, or at least I don't expect you, to memorize the entire structure, but it is important to be able to identify the differences between command staff, general staff, and incident commander. And it's important to know what these areas do and what their jobs are. When I've seen questions on the registry, it'll ask a question like, here is a thing, whose job is that? Is it the planning section chief? Is it a safety officer? So on and so forth. And so you need at least a fundamental understanding of these fellas and their fellaing. We're going to start here in a conversation of the incident commander. The incident commander's job is to, I guess, just be responsible for everything that's on a scene and all the moving parts there. He will exist in a command post. Now, it's interesting to talk about incident commanders and MCIs because it could be very small scale, meaning it could be fireman has shown up in a supervisor vehicle and is now working out of the back of it. He's the incident commander, and he's the back of his truck is the command post. But it could also involve these huge sweeping operations where this fella's got, a dozen people working in close connection with him, and he's got his own RV set up by FEMA, the Red Cross, or otherwise, and it's a literal command station. It just kind of depends on the scale of it. Either way, you need to check in with the incident commander, and that's how you'll kind of get directions. It would be a bad idea, for example, let's picture a 30-car pileup with lots and lots of different agencies and people. It'd be a bad idea to get dispatched to that call, drive immediately in, and just start doing what you think is the best idea, because we might be crossing metaphorical lines, we might be crossing literal lines, and all of our good intentions and ideas might just be working against what the whole plan is, which is set by the incident commander. So it's important to check in. You want to go to that command post. Again, it might just be simply a 2-car pileup with only 4 or 5 patients, and you just walk up to a fireman holding a clipboard or with a fancy white helmet and saying, hey man, what do we got here? Because if you just bypass the structure and go immediately to the scene, you might be causing problems. And in fact, this shouldn't be news to us, because this is exactly how all of our other calls work when they aren't MCIs. If firemen are on scene before us at a house for a guy having a heart attack, we're not going to walk past them, ignore them, and then just address the patient. We're mostly going to walk up to them and essentially check in with a very minor version of an incident commander and say, hey fellas, what do we got? So not only do they work like your boss on scene, and in fact they do become your boss on scene, they also work like dispatch, meaning you're going to want to check in with your incident commander, or at least their command post and structure, each time you need to do something. Hey, we're loading up. Hey, we're out of here. Hey, where do we go? So really you kind of deviate from the normal here once an MCI occurs and start relying on the incident commander or his command staff to figure out what you need to do and where you need to go. Worth mentioning that even though it's usually firemen that take this over, it might be you. You might be the incident commander. If you show up and you're the first people there on an MCI, you are the incident commander. And in fact, sometimes showing up where you're not the first person, you might still be the incident commander. I've shown up on several scenes where there's half a dozen or a dozen people there, and no one has developed a leadership. No one has decided, hey, this is an MCI, or no one has realized it's an MCI, and no one realized the need for someone to kind of step up. And so you'll walk up and say, hey, fellas, what do we got? And they're like, we're trying to figure it out. And you're like, great. I'm going to do a quick triage. I'm going to start orchestrating things. So my goal is essentially to teach you what that might look like and how to do that, largely through triage, but also understanding what your responsibilities are. So that was essentially a brief overview of the incident commander, who he is, and the fact that he might be you. We want to talk now about the command staff. And the command staff, as you can see on this chart, is directly related, directly connected to the incident commander. These are the people that are essentially communicating the incident commander's ideas to other people. Now, there's not always command staff. Again, if it's a 2-car pileup and you're the incident commander, you probably do not have command staff. But if the scene was large enough and you did, these are what they are and what they'll do. We'll start here in a conversation about the safety officer. Put very simply, well, this is the fella that makes sure that the scene is safe for both the patients and the rescuers. This might be on a fire scene. This might be the fellow that's making sure that the fire is out. This is the fellow that might be making sure there's nothing to trip over. Now, having a safety officer doesn't mean your scene is safe, but it is in fact his job ultimately to do that. So always make sure you're doing your own scene size up. You know, if the fireman says, hey, why don't you go over there? That area is secure, get a patient. It doesn't mean that you just walk in and assume that's the case. You want to do your own scene size up and make sure that your booty's covered as well. When we're talking about the liaison officer, this is 2 out of 3 now of the command staff. This is the fella that works as a liaison to communicate between the command staff and the general staff, meaning if you need to talk to an incident commander on a very large scene, you're probably talking to a liaison officer who's then relaying that information to other people. Now, it doesn't mean you can only talk to him, and probably, truth be told, you're talking to your section chief who's talking to the liaison officer. But the point is that if there is somebody that needs to develop the communication between these divisions and somebody that's ultimately responsible for that communication, that's going to be the liaison officer for sure. If the liaison officer is the one that talks interdivision, the public information officer is the person that's speaking outside of the command structure. This is the guy that's talking to the public or to the media about what's happening and why we're doing what we're doing. If we've shut down 4 city blocks and the governor's real mad about that, he's going to want to figure out or know what the heck is happening. Well, when he calls to ask what's happening, the public information officer is the one that's going to answer the phone as far as what's going on inside the command structure, or rather the command system, as it were. So again, that was the command staff. These are the 3 major officers involved in assisting the incident commander communicating both inside the structure and outside of the structure, ultimately responsible for safety and the like. Now we're going to have a discussion about the general staff, and this is where we're going to be trying to figure out what these divisions, sections, and branches are, and who these chiefs are of those, and what their jobs are. I don't think it's important that you understand the terminology of system, breaks into sections, breaks into branches, breaks into divisions and groups. I don't think that's important, but I think conceptually it's important that you understand kind of how these things trickle down. How I remember these different sections here is by reordering them so it spells flop, because it's helpful for my brain and it's hilarious. Specifically, we want to talk about the finance section and the section chief there, the logistics section chief, the operations section chief, which is where fire and EMS and PD are all going to exist. And then the planning division. Like I had mentioned, these names, these terms, all encompass both the sections as well as the people that are responsible for them, called section chiefs. Here, talking about the financial section, and the financial section chief is the fact that we've got a person whose job it is to keep track of how much all this stuff costs. It's not cheap to run MCIs, especially on a large scale, and at some point somebody's going to have to figure out what it all costs and how to get the money and how to allocate all that stuff. And we're talking about both supplies, materials, and paying people to do their jobs. Our logistics section, and therefore the logistics section chief, his job is to provide equipment, food, and water, as well as shelter to patients and rescuers. This is the person that, when everyone needs to eat because we've been on scene for 10 hours, or people are getting overheated and need access to water, or we got to figure out where 72 people need to use the bathroom, this is the guy kind of orchestrating all of that stuff. Operations section chief, the chief of the operations section, is going to be where EMS has the majority of the interactions. I found this confusing earlier because I forgot to change the pictures, so maybe you are as well. But more Heath Ledger and more burning stacks of money, never a bad thing. Meanwhile, the operations section chief, his job is to manage all the tactical activities. This is specifically the fella that's organizing where fire is going, what fire is doing, and likewise for the EMS and police branches as well. Planning section chief. This is the person that's planning, analyzing, investigating, obtaining data, which is all a fancy way to say essentially making the plan. Again, a lot of these guys don't exist and don't come into play until things start to really build up. We're working on a 3-car pileup. We probably don't have a planning section chief. You probably are just relying on the incident commander to do all of these jobs and tell you what's going on. But if it gets so big that he can't, we'll give somebody a fancy jacket, and now it's their job. Developing objectives is another part of the planning section chief's jobs. This is, again, just kind of all falling under the same heading of just figuring out what we have and figuring out what to do about it and marking it out as bullet points so that's easier to understand. When we're talking about operations, this is, of course, where we are going to exist as EMS or fire, and police are going to be a part of that operations. An example of maybe how some of these institutions interact could be something like EMS saying, hey, I need a lot of supplies because of this disaster. And so that communication is going to go to the operations section chief, who would likely talk to the logistics section chief and says, hey, I need you to talk to your medical leader and get on the horn about all these supplies we need, right? So we might talk here to this medical leader. That medical leader might then talk to the finance section chief saying, hey, I know that I have to kind of report in on how much I am spending. Here's the data for that. That guy's going to say, sure, I'll report that to my boss, through the ultimately trying to communicate to the incident commander what they're spending and where that's going. So this guy's going to communicate to a liaison officer, and he's going to talk to the incident commander. And then there may be an outgoing message through the public information officer that's saying, hey, we just spent $10,000 of taxpayer money. You should probably go hold monologue, an interview, disposition about talking to the public through the media about why we just spent $10,000 of taxpayers' money. And that all just originated from a series of EMS people in the operations section requiring materials. And so this is kind of how that might work. It might be pretty confusing. But again, ultimately, I'm just trying to kind of display how these jobs might work or how these jobs might interact. When we're discussing the EMS branch, we need to have a conversation about the medical incident command or the areas that are involved in the EMS branch, like triage, treatment, and staging areas. These areas will sometimes get so large as to require what we would call an incident commander or a section chief, or in this very specific case, a supervisor. Again, I don't think it's entirely important that you remember these, the nomenclature for the breakdowns of these divisions or these jobs in the hierarchy, or the bosses, but it is important that you know that sometimes these areas get so large as to require a boss, and those bosses have different names. Meaning if you have a triage area because you are working a 3-car pileup with only 3 people, well, that triage area might just be you saying, hey, everyone get out of your car, please, and come over here so I can talk to you. If it's a 30-car pileup with 300 patients, that's 10 people in each car or 299 people in one car. Anyway, the point is if it's really large, you might now need somebody to hang out in that triage area and really do some organizing and some work. Ultimately, if you have that triage supervisor for the triage area, they're going to be responsible for counting and prioritizing patients. If we've got an area then where we say, hey, you're green, you're blue, well, blue's not a triage tag, you shouldn't say that. If we have a green, black, red, yellow, and then we put them in these various areas, that area is going to be called the treatment area, where we really start at our secondary triage, where we start treating and transporting patients. And again, if that area gets so large because we have so many people or so many critical people, we'll need a supervisor for that area that's kind of orchestrating all of that stuff. Our third area, our third zone is going to be staging. And that's going to be the area where, let's say that an MCI has been going on for 4 hours. You just got on shift and you get dispatched to respond to this MCI. If it's large enough, there might be a staging area where a staging supervisor says, hey, I don't want you to just go onto scene and complicate things for us. I'd rather you go to 4th and Main. There's a high school there, park there. I've got a guy there who's going to send you into the scene as we need you, and you'll just hang out there. This is kind of an example, a mock example of a scene that might develop. In this case, it's, let's call it a structure fire. Maybe it's an apartment building or something of the like. More often than not, it's going to be firemen going into an extrication area here. Pull up a laser pointer, I think. We might have fire going into the extrication area, but if it's just you, it might be you. I'm not saying that EMS often goes into fire scenes, but if it weren't a structure fire, maybe it was just a crashed car, and that crashed car is the extrication area, and you need to go into the car and get the person out because it's safe enough, and you're the only person there. When we talk about these different areas, I think it's fair enough to discuss them like zones. If you remember, we have hot zones, warm zones, we have cold zones. As you can see here, we've got the warm zone, which is the decon area, assuming, though, that this isn't a hazmat scene, and more to the point that it's just MCI without hazmat stuff. We don't traditionally refer to these things as hot, warm, and cold. These are going to be, conceptually, they're going to be referring to hazmat stuff, not just MCI stuff. But I still think it's good to bring up. I think it's important to realize that these are essentially the same ideas that we're discussing here. In that regard. So if I had to go over to a car to help somebody out of it, help the 4 people out of it to the street, then that would be my extrication area that I'm pulling them out of. Whatever area I move them to start figuring out what in the heck we have here, that's going to be our triage area. Now, we don't do triaging traditionally in an extrication area. Like, we're not going to be walking through a burning building and saying, hey, you're a green tag, you're a red tag. We're mostly going to be trying to get them out of a hot zone, out of a danger zone, to a place that is not an immediate danger, so we can start triaging them. And then moving them after that, after we've designated whether or not they're green or yellow or red, to an area where we can start receiving treatment, and transport might be treatment and transport area might be a valuable way to describe this. Let's see how my childish, like very scary ransom note looking writing is here. Now you'll notice that if you recall, there's no black tag here. And that's simply because if somebody gets a black tag, they just get left where they are, meaning the black tag people would be probably still in the extrication area. We're not going to use resources to get a corpse out of an extrication area when we have other people that need our care. So, lastly, we have a staging area that does not exist as a zone in hazmat stuff, though staging areas could exist in hazmat areas for sure. And again, this is just the place that we're parking. In a certain sense, I think it might be appropriate to say that a staging area is an area where we're trying to determine or allow people to come into a scene. Okay. And the treatment and transport area is mostly where people are staging to be released from the scene, if that makes sense. So now we're going to get into a very important part of the lecture, which is triage. If you remember the three-pronged intro, triage is what we're going to be discussing now, what it is and how to do it. The ultimate point of triage is just to do as much as we can for as many people as we can. What it is not is to do as much as we can for one person. If I've got 10 people and one of them is in cardiac arrest, that's a huge need, but I don't want to just spend 20 minutes doing a cardiac arrest or working a cardiac arrest when I have 9 other people who might have bleeding that's going to kill them that I could stop with merely just direct pressure or a tourniquet. Another thing that triage is not is to do everything as we can for everyone as we can, which I know language makes no sense, but is pretty funny to me. What I mean to say is that if I have 10 people, I don't want to just say, oh, okay, well, I'll just do something for everybody here. Okay, well, that's also not a good idea. That's also not what triage is. We're trying to figure out, what the most effective use of our time is. And in fact, triage is about making hard choices. Triage is about hearing somebody call out to you, asking or begging for help, and you know they're beyond help, or you know that you can't stop and help them right now, because if you do, many other people are going to suffer. It's also about making choices as efficiently as you can, meaning we want to figure out where the need is. We also want to figure out where my time is best spent. And at the end of the day, we want to be able to do this as fast as we can, so that way we're not wasting time anywhere. Realistically, triaging patients should be a 5 to 10 second experience if done well and if possible. Sometimes they require a little bit more communication, but the point is that it needs to be quick. The more efficient it is, the more effective it will be. And that could translate to being quicker. If I get my 10 patients triaged, then I can start helping and affecting their care as soon as possible. Triage tags are what we use to designate different patients. I mean, conceptually, we're using the idea of black tag, red tag, yellow tag, green, or expectant, immediate, delayed, and minor are the terms used as well. Sometimes we'll use physical tags. Admittedly, in my entire career, I've never used physical tags to represent triage patients. I've either not had access to them, or it just wasn't necessary at the time, or someone else was doing it. So I don't have a lot of exposure to this. I still think it's important to kind of display. I'm showing you these tags here, but I actually don't think it's valuable to spend much time discussing what triage tags, how to utilize them specifically, because there's a million different brands and a million different versions. So the moment I explain how these work, you're going to work at a place that has a different one. So I think it's more important to kind of discuss triage as an idea. They are color coded. This is a way of getting our brain right around, okay, what kind of patient am I talking to right now? Is this a patient that is an immediate need, or is this a person that can wait for care and the like? It's also worth noting that this differs from standard patient assessment, that if you're in MCI triage mode, if that's your job, you are basically not a medical professional currently. You're a logistics officer of some type. You are not performing a general impression. You are not asking about life threats. It is a whole different frame of thinking. And so what might happen is I walk up to a person, ask a series of three or four triage questions, and then move on. Then I go to my next patient, ask the series of triage specific questions, and then move on. Questions like, are they breathing? And what's their respiratory rate like and stuff. Triage is kind of like we just extrapolated the ABCs of a normal patient assessment because we just want the barest minimums to figure out the status of our patient. Now, admittedly, when we move through triage, let's say I have 10 people, once I ask those series of questions to those 10 people, well, I've now prioritized their needs, and I go to the patient with the highest priority, and I then begin a standard patient assessment. But it's important to note that there are different schools of thought here. One is a one-on-one patient assessment stuff. The other, for triage, is a much more condensed and expedited version of that, and it's in fact a wholly different experience. This is what they call start triage on the left here for adults and jump start triage on the right for pediatrics. This is traditionally how it's taught about how to work through triage. I wonder here, I'm gonna zoom in, we'll see how this works. I just want to take a second and discuss these tags specifically, who this is and what that might mean. Let's see if I can zoom in and draw on it. I cannot. So we'll start pretty simply here with the minor tags. Of course, minor does not mean a child or pediatric specifically. It just means minor injuries. We refer to those people as the walking wounded because how this starts is you announce to a scene. You walk up, 10 cars, a bunch of people, some out of the vehicle, some in the vehicle, some injured, some not injured, just a myriad of different presentations and displays. And what I want to ask first is, can anyone hear me? Are you able to walk? If you can walk, please go over here to what I say is the trees. Just to remember that it's a green tag. There's a tree, not a hand or a piece of broccoli. Gross. It looks grosser the more I try to fix it. Anyway, the point is I want to go to a scene and just announce, if you can hear me, please come over here, right? Now, if you remember, when I say please come over here, I'm pulling them out of the extrication zone with my voice, getting them over to our primary triage point where I'm really starting to figure out who these people are, where I can safely triage them. Anyways, all the people that can walk are green tags, which means that there's a dividing line here where these are our walking wounded, the greens, and everyone else are people that cannot walk. What I think is interesting about this is, by definition, if a fella has lost an arm and is bleeding to death but can walk over to you, he, at least by definition, is a green tag. And you might be saying, surely that's not a minor injury. And it's not. That he'll go now to the treatment area where he'll be triaged again. So your primary triage experience, your first tag you hand somebody, isn't the end of their experience. They get reevaluated. But it's first important to get the walking wounded out of the area. Again, these are victims with relatively minor injuries. Status is unlikely to deteriorate over days. They can assist in their own care. And in fact, sometimes you might even use green tagged people to assist you in your experience. If you've got a patient who's suffering and you are alone or with only one other clinician, you might be giving green tags jobs to help you with the other tags. So anyway, there's our first question. Are you able to walk? If the answer is yes, then please go over here to secondary triage and you are given a green tag. If for all remaining people who are laying on the ground, seated, leaned up against something and whatnot, we then want to ask our number 2 question, which is, do they have spontaneous breathing? Are they breathing? If a person is not breathing, it's not the end of our experience. We now need to position their airway. And positioning a person's airway might be a head tilt chin lift. It is often going to be a jaw thrust by technicality because we don't know if there was trauma. If you're not breathing and I adjust your airway with a jaw thrust and then you start breathing on your own, okay, you get a red tag. You're now in immediate care. If I position your airway and it does not cause spontaneous respirations, you are in a black tag, or given a black tag, as it were, and we move on. One of the misconceptions, or an important point to note perhaps about this, is the idea of spontaneous respirations. What I mean by that is you should know that it doesn't require you to maintain the airway. So if you're not breathing and I do a head tilt chin lift and you start breathing, you get a red tag. I don't have to hold that position. I don't have to hold that head tilt chin lift for you to determine whether or not you are expectant or immediate. However, if I position a person's airway and they can breathe, but when I let go, they stop breathing, it might behoove us to ask one of these green tags to help us. But by definition of the tags, it all revolves around the concept of, again, spontaneous breathing. I did a thing. Are you breathing on your own now? Not, am I required to help you with it? Okay. So we've talked a little here now about red. We've talked a little bit about the black tags. Let's say our patient is not breathing, right? Like let's say that essentially they can't walk, right? They're not walking wounded, but they are breathing on their own. Well, now it's a question of how are they breathing? Or specifically, what is their respiratory rate? Well, if it's over 30, and of course this is adults, if it's over 30, so they are breathing, they can't walk, the respiratory rate is 30. I keep saying over 30. It's technically 30 or above. I find that very confounding. So anyways, if they're breathing at 30 or above, they're a red tag. And we're done asking questions. And anytime we discover what tag a person is, we're done asking questions. We move on. They don't have to qualify for all 3 of these. They just need to qualify for one of them before we stop asking questions. So again, now we've determined essentially that our patient cannot walk, they are breathing, and we now are asking a question of respiratory rate. Well, again, if they have 30 or above, red tag and move on to the next patient. If they have less than 30, well, we now start asking a question about perfusion. One thing that's worth noting here that this graphic doesn't display is that it's not just 30. It's not just tachypnea. It's also bradypnea, meaning if they are less than 10 or greater or equal to 30, we would consider that normal. No, that's not right. Specifically, and this is why I hate the way they write this. In fact, let's move all of this. A normal respiratory rate would be considered anything that is 10 to 29 in respect to triage. So if it's less than 10 or greater or equal to 30, that person gets red tagged. Gross. Now let's say that they can't walk, they are breathing, and their respiratory rate does fall in a normal range, meaning, of course, between 10 and 29, or I should say maybe acceptable range. Then we ask the second question. This is question 1. This is question 2 in regards to that. We now are asking, well, do they have a radial pulse? Or are they experiencing capillary refill delay? Now, you might say, well, wait a second. What if they're an unconscious patient? Shouldn't I be checking a carotid pulse? Well, ordinarily, that would be true for sure. But generally speaking, those people are going to fall up here in these categories anyways. But nonetheless, I don't usually discuss radial pulse absent or weak concepts, simply because when this is done well and this is done fast, capillary refill is a much easier way to determine what's happening. But either way, if they qualify for either of these things, either a absence of radial pulse or a delayed cap refill, well, then that person is going to get red tagged. And like we had mentioned before, as soon as we discover their tag, we move on. We can stop asking questions. Let's say that we have a patient here who is not able to walk, right? Let's say we have a patient who is breathing on their own, whose respiratory rate falls within the normal range between 10 and 29, and they do have a radial pulse that's present, and their capillary refill is not delayed, right? So they're okay here. The next question we need to ask is, what is their mental status like? Or more to the point, do they follow our commands? Well, if they don't follow your commands, then they get a red tag and we move on. If they do follow your commands, well, then they get a yellow tag and we move on. What's important to know here, or I guess I should say what I do in this regard, is I always ask the to and fro finger question. It's where I take my finger and I hold up a number 1 and I say, hey, I need you to follow my finger, okay? And I move it towards their nose, away from their nose. I move it to their left side of their face, to their right side of their face. When a person can follow that appropriately, it gives me the information that they're following my commands. They understand the game. And it's also actually secretly telling me about the innervation of a lot of their cervical nerves, or cranial nerves rather, which is really good information. But not ultimately the point of triage. So it would be completely appropriate just to ask them really any question. Hey, can you nod your head? Of course, there's a problem with that. If they have a cervical spinal injury, you might say, hey, can you reach out and grab my fingers? Well, if they've got amputated limbs, that's not good there either. But as long as they can follow a command, they'll qualify here. Okay. Sometimes people get confused about what if one or the other of these. This is an or experience. So if they qualify for either, that's a problem. Meaning, let's say I feel a radial pulse, but their capillary refill is delayed. Okay, well, whatever the bad sign is, that's what wins. If there was some world where they had good capillary refill, but you couldn't feel a pulse, well, again, the bad wins the cake, and we put them in immediate. So if either one of these things is true, then they get a red tag. If it's not, we move on to our next question. We'll talk in a minute here about how the jumpstart triage differs, but for what it's worth, we're just pointing out the primary differences. We can see here in positioning an adult airway. If I position them and they start breathing on their own, great, red tag. If I position their airway and they don't start breathing on their own, bad, black tag. The big difference here for pediatrics is the concept of rescue breaths. What that means specifically, and here's the kind of order of events as far as that goes. I am talking to a proctor here in a scenario and I say, is my patient able to walk? And they say, well, no, it's a toddler, so they didn't walk before. I say, okay. My next question is my patient breathing? And they say, no, your toddler is not breathing. And I say, okay, whoopsie. How many whoopsies in this presentation? Who could know? No, my patient isn't breathing. Well, I then want to position the airway with a jaw thrust. Did they start breathing now? And he says, no, they don't. Okay, if this were an adult, that would be at the end of the conversation. The second part of the conversation, now that it's a pediatric, is okay, well, do I palpate a pulse? The instructor says, no, you do not palpate a pulse. Okay, then that's a black tag and that's the end of it. What's worth noting that if I do palpate a pulse, okay, well, then I want to help them even further with 5 rescue breaths. If they start breathing on their own, well, fantastic, red tag. If after I position their airway, do feel a pulse and give 5 rescue breaths, they are not spontaneously breathing, well, that's tragic. Now they're a black tag and we move on. So again, to just kind of walk through this, like in a live scenario situation, playing both parts, I'm a student and I say, I'm going to call out to the walking wounded. The instructor says, okay. I then say, okay, well, I'm going to walk up to my first patient. He says, it's a 1-year-old. I say, okay. Does my 1-year-old track me as I walk up? He says, no, their eyes are closed. I say, okay. Is my patient breathing? He says, no, they're not. I say, okay, I'm going to position their airway with a jaw thrust. Do they develop spontaneous respirations? He says, no, they don't. I say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and palpate a pulse before I move on. He says, yes, they do have a pulse. You can feel it. I say, okay. Then I'm going to administer 5 rescue breaths. Are they now spontaneously breathing? If he says, yes, they're breathing on their own now, I'd say, great, they're a red tag. If he says, no, when you stop your 5 rescue breaths, they don't take their own breaths, well, then the answer would be black tag and move on. Lastly, what we want to discuss as far as I guess not lastly, but secondly, perhaps, what we want to discuss about differences with pediatrics is the idea of our respiratory rate. As you notice over here in adults, like I said, it was 10 to 29. For pediatrics, it is 15 to 45. If you're like me at all, you find it very frustrating that this is 29 and this is not 44 or something. Anyway, the point is you should know that the respiratory rate pattern changes, or the requirements of the rate change, and that's largely just simply because children, the smaller you are, the more breaths you need to take. In fact, the differences in their airway requirements is partly why we have these 5 rescue breaths as part of that experience, because children are far more receptive to oxygenation and much better at compensation than adults are. So if you still have a pulse and aren't breathing, well, then we'll give you 5 rescue breaths. If you do start spontaneous respirations, we now have essentially a much higher requirement for that, 15 to 45. The only other thing I suppose worth mentioning in regards to changes is if you get a child so small that they aren't able to follow commands, period, well, then we're just looking for our neurological assessment essentially to be AVPU, put very simply. Maybe a child is so young that their brain is not developed well enough to follow commands of even their parents, right? As much toddlers or infants are, essentially. Specifically, then, we're just using AVPU as the designator. Now, in talking about the crux of triage, the whole the rub, the real deal with why triage is difficult, it is not because of green tags and black tags. If I yell out to a crowd and say, "Hey, everyone that can hear me should walk over here," okay, that's easy. Those people are green tagged, right? It's worth noting that sometimes people don't hear you, right? Simply calling out to the air does not mean you have now solved the green tag mystery. You might need to walk up to your first patient after having assigned green tags and just ask a person like, "Hey brother, how you doing? Can you get up and come with me?" Like, that's a good greeting. If they say, "No, I just heard you," and "No, I can't, that's why I didn't," I mean, that's fine. But they might say, "Oh, yeah, I can," and they just couldn't hear you over their own pain. Somebody else is crying, the roar of engines, the sirens, like they just might not have heard you. So again, it might be completely reasonable to just ask, hey, how are you? Can you get up right now? And then to just say no, and you to move on with your investigation of that patient. Also, part of the reason why I haven't handed out many tags is consider that if I've got 30 people laying around and I yell out, "If anyone can hear me, please come over here," and 20 of those people do, I am not going to spend 15 minutes handing out and tearing green tags for those patients while a person bleeding to death suffers, right? So I just have all those people go over to an area. As easy as green tag is, so too is most black tags, essentially, because this just means I'm just walking up to people who are unresponsive and aren't breathing. And with adults, I just adjust their airway. And if they're not breathing, boom, black tag. So when I say the crux of triage, the real hard part of triage, I am not talking about green and black tags. Those are pretty obvious. What I'm talking about is who's the yellow tag and who's the red tag. Now, truth be told, what we're really trying to differentiate here is who is my yellow tag, because everyone else is a red tag. If all the green tags have walked over here and all the black tags are so obvious because they're corpses, the real question is who's a yellow tag? And that can be done with what we describe as 32 can do. Now, 32 can do talks about a respiratory rate. This is for our yellow patients. If your respiratory rate is less than 30, so 10 to 29, if your cap refill is less than 2 seconds and therefore not delayed, and you can follow my commands, I'm going to back up here. But if you remember, well, that's essentially these 3 questions in here, right? Primarily, right? That's these 3 questions. And if you don't qualify for any of those things, well, fantastic. You get a yellow tag, right? So here we have our patient, our 32 can do patient, and we say, yes, I say, I've walked up to a patient who is not a walking wounded, okay? I walked up to a patient who is not a black tag because they are breathing on their own, right? Where you would discover this is when you say, I'm going to walk up to my patient and say, "Hey, can you get up and come with me?" The proctor says, "No." They say, "No, I can't." Well, the fact that they're talking to me means that they do have an open airway, right? So they're not a black tag. So they're neither of these things. I then ask these 3 questions, right? 1, 2, 3. What's the respiratory rate? The proctor will say, it's 28. Well, great. It's less than 30. Do they have a delayed cap refill? No, or it's instant. Okay. And can they to and fro my finger, right? I'm going to do the to and fro. Or, "Sir, can you, oops, there's an R. Sir, can you," boy, oh boy, does that look spooky. "Sir, can you follow my finger?" So if they qualify for those 3 things, bam, they get a yellow tag. Congratulations. If any of these things fall outside of the normal, then you get a red tag. Everybody else is a red tag. So again, I called out to the crowd. I walk up to the person that did not get up and become a walking wounded. I say, "Hey, brother, can you get up right now? Can you come with me?" They say, "No." Okay, well, the fact that he just talked to me means he's not green and he's not black tagged, which means I need to figure out if he's yellow. And I do that with a 32 can do. "Proctor, what is my respiratory rate?" It's 12. Okay, well, 12 is less than 30. "What is my cap refill like? Is it delayed?" And he says, no, it's not delayed. Okay, great. Does he follow my commands? Yes, he does. Yellow tag. Blammo, blammo. Again, the 32 and can do thing does not account for bradypnea or a respiratory rate less than 10. It also doesn't account for radial pulses, which is valuable. But when the pudding hits the fan, let's say, and 2 years from now, when you're recerting for registry or whatever the case is, this is what I found most valuable for just getting me in the ballpark of how triage should work. When we discuss concepts of jump start triage, right? That's for the pediatric or child. We want to add in these couple of changes or make sure that we're aware of these changes. Specifically, jumpstart triage is for children under 8 years old, but conceptually, it's enough to say, well, if they look like a child, then let's add on these other two caveats here. Again, we're adding 5 rescue breaths after a jaw thrust. If you remember the fact that this only applies if they have a pulse. So perhaps, oopsie, is that number 4 oopsies? We need a tally somewhere. Let's go ahead and put it down here. Oopsie tallies times infinity. My, oh my, I hope I get better at that. Okay. Anyways, the point is this person needs to have a pulse present to qualify for this, as you recall. And then the respiratory rate changes from 10 to 29 to 15 to 45. This is an example. I don't want to spend a bunch of time here. We worked through this already. I put this up here because sometimes students need just kind of a concrete way of knowing what to say. And this is a script for that, kind of broken down and the like. I think it's worth noting that I don't include reference to pulse in here either. So I'll leave this up here essentially for you to take a screenshot of or pull up the slideshow of and familiarize yourself with this if you want to at a later date. It is worth noting, though, that I put this statistically at the end, this phrase, not statistically, but maybe categorically at the end. This statement being, we're going to get you care as soon as possible. Stay here and I'll be back to help you. We're going to be saying this to not just people when we, not just people who are yellow tagged or red tagged, but really just anybody we tag, except for the black tag. Oh, we're missing a parentheses right here. If I give somebody a yellow tag, I want to then just say, hey, we're going to get you care as soon as possible. Stay here. I'll be back as soon as I can, or I'll be back to help you, or someone will be back to help you, something of that like. Okay. Here again is our reference to the areas and the zones. You hopefully have heard me mention several times the concept of primary and secondary triage. These are good phrases to understand. Again, let's picture that this is not a burning house, and it's maybe just a car where I pulled somebody out of it because it was not a dangerous scene for me. Wherever they are, where I give them their first tag is their primary triage area. If I pull two people out of a vehicle and have several of them kind of come over to an area where I line them up or look at them in a pile or whatever the case is, and I want to say, hey, red tag, yellow tag, green tag, black tag, or whatever. If we're where they go next, like let's say fire shows up or 2 more ambulances show up, and then I say, hey, ambulance 1, you've got this patient, they're a green tag, take them to your ambulance. Ambulance 2, you have a yellow tag, please take them to your ambulance. And ambulance 3, you have a red tag, please take them to your ambulance. Those ambulances are the treatment area. And that's where secondary triage is going to be performed. This is going to be where they say, okay, wait a second. This guy said green tag. He is not. He is actually a red tag, because it turns out that even though he could walk, he was bleeding to death from an injury that was not found. So I just want to pull this up just to remind you and conceptualize the fact that you want to move through this primary triage and in this triage area very fast and as effective as you can, so that way you can get them to the treatment area so we can reevaluate them and give what they need. You can skip this part. If you listened to it and found it incredibly confusing, this is a way that helps me kind of conceptualize why we prioritize the treatment for our red tags or our immediate patients. If you look here at the what we might describe the critical nature of somebody's problem, okay, a green tag might be an example of a paper cut, let's say, right? Let's say this guy's got a paper cut. That's a very minor injury. The critical nature of his injury is very low. Let's say that this guy is in a cardiac arrest. Okay, the critical nature of heart and respiratory pattern stopping is enormous. The black tag has a way higher critical nature than the green tag, right? That much makes sense. Well, if we consider how much effort that requires, it's not a whole lot of effort to put a Band-Aid on a paper cut. It is, however, an enormous amount of effort to spend on a cardiac arrest. Well, we have to do triage fast. And if this guy, with his incredible critical nature of his injury and his incredible effort required is this high, if I spend all my time here, essentially, all these other people might suffer. So lastly, we have to look at the idea of treatment efficacy, or rather, how effective is the treatment that I'm administering to this patient, right? And what do we say? A asystolic arrest, a flatline arrest that might look like this, the national survival rate for that, 5% survival rate. 100 people go into asystole, an unwitnessed arrest. Only 5 out of 100 people are going to live if we do cardiac arrest protocols, CPR on them. We don't want to spend all of this effort on something that has a 5% chance of affecting them. Essentially, that means our treatment efficacy of 5% is super duper low. And so the whole point, as you've probably already discovered, is we want to find out where our treatment efficacy intersects with, that was poorly drawn, intersects or collides with our effort required and the critical nature. And that happens right here with our red tags or immediate. An example of this might be the fact that a person has an arterial bleed and they are now in compensation. So the respiratory pattern is really high. And if I just put a tourniquet on them, we're going to control that bleeding. And that's important. Okay. So this concludes our discussion about MCI and triage, and you now have no questions and are an expert in triage and dare not ever ask me about it again. Thank you so much. No, primarily, of course, I know that this opens a giant can of worms about what ifs and possibilities, and I think that's great discourse. I think that's excellent discussion. So you're more than welcome to email me, to reach out. Again, I want to further encourage you to read your book, because I might be wrong about some things, and there might be some things of value that I just don't know or luckily hadn't experienced. So again, read your books, review the tests and quizzes as they appear, and don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask any questions that you have. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time.